welcome to Feminist Question Time. Feminist Question Time is brought to you by Women's Human Rights Campaign. Many of you will have come already, so you'll know that. Our main focus is defending women's sex-based rights, and that you could find more information on our website, womensdeclaration.com, where you'll find our declaration on women's sex-based rights. It's been signed by 15,030 people from 127 countries and is supported by 310 organizations. This week, we are focusing on feminism and the environment, and we have three speakers. We have Lierre Keith from the United States, we have Susan Hawthorne from Australia, and we have Kate Graham from the UK. Each of our speakers is going to give a 20 to 25-minute presentation on the theme of feminism and the environment and around those themes. First of all, we're going to hear from Lierre Keith. She's the author of 7 books and has been a radical feminist for 40 years. She is the co-founder of Wolf, and she's going to talk to us about her new book, which has been published in the last couple of days, which is Bright Green Lies. And so it's a great pleasure for me to be able to welcome Lierre Keith. Over to you, Lierre.
There we go. In the beginning, 2 million years ago, don't worry, I'm going to go fast, the genus Homo arrives on the plains of Africa, and that's us. Homo sapiens appears 400,000 years ago, and by 200,000 years ago, they're identical to modern humans. By 100,000 years ago, we're burying our dead, and we're doing it ritualistically. By 50,000 years ago, we have modern human culture. People are making clothes from hides, jewelry, musical instruments. They've got more sophisticated hunting techniques. There's barter, and there's art. We're painting a lot of animals. And this is the second most common art project. The oldest known musical instrument was found near her. It was a flute carved from a vulture bone. And there are the remains of the usual reindeer, cave bear, ibex, mammoths, all the animals people were eating. The first art we ever made was art of the megafauna and the megafemales, because that was who gave us life. The first thing we did with our human consciousness was say thank you. I think this is the beginning of religion, and that the sacredness of awe and thanksgiving is built into us, body and brain. And for all that time, for 2 million years, we were not monsters and destroyers. We were participants. If the length of that field is our time on Earth, it's only the last half yard that represents the time we've been doing agriculture. The last 1/5 of an inch would be the Industrial Revolution. So at half a yard is where the disaster begins. In maybe 14 places around the world, people completely change their way of life with an activity called agriculture. In very brute terms, you take a piece of land, you clear every living thing off it, and I mean down to the bacteria, and then you plant it to human use. So it's biotic cleansing. This is Iraq, one of the places agriculture started. No one in their right mind would call this place the Fertile Crescent now. This is Iran. 94% of the land is degraded. That's not a mountain in the background, that's dust. That's soil that's been turned to dust. Pakistan, 1/3 of the country is at risk for desertification. 150 years ago, this was a teak forest. You pull down the forest, you rip up the prairie, you drain the wetland, you exsanguinate the world of water and soil and species, and the process of life itself, until all that is left is dust. So to state the obvious, no culture that is destroying the basis of life can be called sustainable. Really, it can only be called insane. This is the first day of the Dust Bowl in South Dakota. In all the places where agriculture started, human society follows the same pattern. It's called civilization. Now that word just means people living in cities. What that actually means is that they need more than the land can give. Food, water, energy have to come from somewhere else. From that point forward, it doesn't matter what lovely, peaceful, nonviolent values people hold in their hearts, the society is dependent on imperialism and genocide because no one willingly gives up their land, their water, their trees. But since the city has used up its own, it has to go out and get those from somewhere else. And that's the last 10,000 years in a few sentences. This is simple arithmetic. If you have one planet, one blanket of air, one cradle of soil, one place called home, and you destroy it, it's 1 minus 1. And this is the pattern of civilization over and over. There's a bloated power center surrounded by conquered colonies from which the center extracts what it wants until eventually it collapses. And that collapse takes between 800 and maybe 2,000 years until the soil gives out. Make no mistake, the planet has been skinned alive, and what should be habitat for millions of creatures turns into salt and dust. Agricultural societies end up militarized, and they always do, for 3 reasons. 1, agriculture creates a surplus, and if it can be stored, it can be stolen. So agriculturists need that surplus to be protected. Number 2 is imperialism. Agriculture is a war against the natural world. Eventually, the agriculturalists need more land, more soil, more resources. So there's an entire class of people whose job is war, whose job is taking land and resources by force. Agriculture makes that possible. It also makes it inevitable. And 3 is slavery. By the year 1800, it's the beginning of the fossil fuel age, 3/4 of the people on the planet were living in conditions of slavery, indenture, or serfdom. The only reason we've forgotten that is because we're using machines now, fossil fuel, to do that work. And of course, once you have huge numbers of the population in slavery, you need someone to keep them there. The symbiosis of technology and culture is what Lewis Mumford called a technic. A social milieu creates specific technologies, which in turn shape the culture. He writes, a new configuration of technical invention, scientific observation, and centralized political control gave rise to the peculiar mode of life we may now identify without eulogy as civilization. Its Herculean feats of mechanical organization rested on ruthless physical coercion, forced labor, and slavery. This centralized techniques created complex human machines composed of specialized, standardized, replaceable, interdependent parts, the work army, the military army, the bureaucracy. These work armies and military armies raised the ceiling of human achievement, the first in mass construction, the second in mass destruction, both on a scale hitherto inconceivable. Technology is anything but neutral or passive in its effects. The plowshares will require swords and then armies of slaves and soldiers. The technique that is civilization has required weapons of conquest from the beginning. Farming spread by genocide, the destruction of Cro-Magnon Europe, the culture that bequeathed us Lascaux, took maybe 300 years by the farmer soldiers from the Near East. The only thing exchanged between the two cultures was violence. All these artifacts are weapons, and there is no reason to believe that they were exchanged in a nonviolent manner. Technologies contain the transmutational force of a technic, creating a seamless suite of social institutions and corresponding ideologies. Technics are never neutral. Their ideologies will either be authoritarian or democratic, hierarchical or egalitarian, or as Chellis Glendinning writes with spare eloquence, all technologies are political. So the very creation myth of Western civilization tells men to dominate, to conquer, to go forth and multiply. No hunter-gatherer is told by God to willfully overshoot the land's carrying capacity, and no marginally rational person would listen to such a God. Alongside agriculture, metallurgy and mining developed as another authoritarian technique. The first metal tools were mostly weapons, and they were copper, but copper was quickly replaced by bronze, which is made from an alloy of copper and tin. Iron came next, and finally steel. It's not possible to overstate the deleterious impact that metallurgy has had on human societies and biotic communities. It hardly matters which material we examine, the horrors are the same. The forest stripped to bare rock, the rocks hacked, bludgeoned, or bombed into cavernous pits, the pits engulfing sweeps of land that will not recover until the next ice age recedes. Surrounding the devastation is always more: the leach ponds, the toxic tailings, the acid rain, the ulcerated fish, the fine particulates shredding lung tissue with every breath. This photo is of a toxic lake 60 miles wide, the result of mining for rare earth metals for solar panels. In the 8 centuries of Rome's reign, it covered Greenland, which is 4,000 miles away, in 800 tons of copper and 400 tons of lead from its mines. Victims of Rome's industrial pollution may have numbered in the millions across Europe and the Middle East. The health impacts then as now are ghastly: convulsions, vomiting, diarrhea, anemia, stunted fetal growth, mental retardation, and cancer. Wadi Fainan in modern-day Jordan was the site of an ancient copper mine. 2,000 years has not been enough time to heal the damage from the mine. To this day, quote, the growth of the plants is stunted and their reproductive systems severely damaged. Sheep have disturbing concentrations of copper in their feces, urine, and milk. Goats from the area are in high demand because they have no parasites. But this is almost certainly because their guts are poisonous. A deathly monument of slag still rises 30 meters high. This is why mines are always fiercely opposed by the people condemned to endure them. And this was a cedar forest 2,000 years ago. And so the work army requires the military army. Slaves have to be conquered and then controlled. The silver mines of ancient Greece funded its vast imperial army. Devastation, destruction, and slavery, spawning more of the same. That is the totalizing scale of authoritarian techniques, which both creates and then requires hierarchical social relations, turning humans into machines that convert more life into more machines. And as all of this develops, the slavery, the militarism, the hierarchy, the culture becomes patriarchal. The moment men create private property, they want to control paternity, which means they need to control women. So masculinity is essential to any militarized culture because that's the psychology necessary in soldiers. One can only kill on command if the human impulse to care for one another has been subdued or even eradicated, and if the psychological process of othering is well entrenched. Central to masculinity is a violation imperative. Men become, quote, real men by breaking boundaries. For the entitled psyche, the only reason no exists is because it's a sexual thrill to force past it. The real brilliance of patriarchy is right here. It doesn't just naturalize oppression, it sexualizes acts of oppression. It eroticizes domination and submission, and then institutionalizes them into masculinity and femininity. So it naturalizes, it eroticizes, and then institutionalizes domination and submission. The brilliance of feminism is that we figured that out. So all of it merges in that masculine violation imperative. That imperative includes breaking the sexual boundaries of women and children, the cultural and political boundaries of Indigenous people, the biological boundaries of rivers and forests, the genetic boundaries of other species, and the physical boundaries of the atom itself. Authoritarian techniques require a specific social arrangement: patriarchal, hierarchical, militaristic, specialized, and mechanistic. All of that requires, as it produces, an internal theological rationale that life is a series of disconnected objects, things that we might call plants or animals or rivers, not complex beings with whom we are engaged in relationships. Mechanical objects are not self-willed creatures. They don't call respect from us. They barely deserve notice. They exist to be used. René Descartes bragged, "I have described this earth and indeed this whole visible world as a machine." Our science is a series of discoveries designed to let us use them better, and use them we have. There is no break in the system. Why would there be? Indeed, violation is built into mechanistic science. Francis Bacon, who is credited with the creation of the scientific method, was also a legal inquisitor at witch trials. His practical objective was bluntly, quote, dominion over creation, which could be achieved by, quote, the inquisition of mechanical experimentation. 300 years later, Erich Fromm describes sadism as, quote, the passion to have absolute and unrestricted control over a living being. Is there a more apt description of industrial civilization? Its technology has emptied rivers, crushed mountains, damaged the climate, and broken the boundaries of the atom itself. And the endpoint of sadism is necrophilia, the passion to transform that which is alive into something unalive, to destroy for the sake of destruction, the exclusive interest in all that is purely mechanical. Or as Mary Daly wrote in 1978, patriarchy is itself the prevailing religion of the entire planet, and its essential message is necrophilia. Having declared the cosmos lifeless, industrial humans are now transforming the biosphere into the technosphere, a dead world of our own artifacts that life as a whole may not survive. So that's chapter 1 of our book, Bright Green Lies. I was trying to set the framework for the rest of it. We have 3 main themes in the other 12 chapters. So the facts as they stand. The first is that industrial civilization requires industrial levels of energy. That's what it takes to fuel the wholesale conversion of living communities into dead commodities. That conversion is itself the problem. The task before us is not how to continue to fuel that conversion, it's how to stop it. The second point is that fossil fuel, especially oil, is functionally irreplaceable. The proposed alternatives like solar, wind, hydro, biomass will never scale up to power an industrial economy. You can't argue with physics, Bill McKibben likes to say. No, you can't, and he of all people should know better. Third, the proposed technologies are in their own right assaults against the living world. From the beginning to end, they require industrial scale devastation, open pit mining, deforestation, soil toxification that's permanent on anything but a geologic timescale, extirpation and extinction of vulnerable species, and oh yes, fossil fuels. So-called green technologies are some of the most destructive industrial processes ever invented, and the scale of them is grotesque. They will not save the earth, they will only hasten its demise. Once we fought for the living, now we are told to fight for their deaths, as the turbines come for the mountains and solar conquers the deserts. Every last one of us descends from a line of people who fought, as civilization is universally resisted. But our choice is now very stark: stand with the living or go down with the dead. So I was asked a set of very specific questions, most of which I think I've covered, but 2 are not addressed directly. So if I've got a moment, I'm going to finish this. One question: why do you keep focusing on environmental issues? And I think that's a really good question given the war against women. But my answer is, to quote Rachel Carson, there would be no peace for me if I kept silent. And the second question: is transgender ideology linked in any way to climate change and the destruction of life on Earth? And yes, it's deeply connected. And in getting ready for this presentation, I went back into Mary Daly's book, Gynecology, to grab that quote from her. And I read that book 40 years ago, like literally 40 years ago this month, I was reading that book. And I cannot believe how prophetic she was. So I'm going to let her answer that question because I can't say this any better. Mary Shelley, I can't read it, I hope you can. She wrote Frankenstein, foretelling the technological father's fusion of male mother miming and necrophilia, and a boundary violation that ultimately points toward the total elimination of women. Today, the Frankenstein phenomenon is omnipresent, not only in religious myth, but in its offspring, phallocratic technology. The insane desire for power, the madness of boundary violation, is the mark of necrophiliacs who sense the lack of soul, spirit, life-loving principle with themselves, and therefore try to invade and kill off all spirit, substituting conglomerates of corpses. Transsexualism is an example of male surgical siring, which invades the female world with substitutes. Male-mothered genetic engineering is an attempt to create without women. The projected manufacture by men of artificial wombs, of cyborgs, which will be part flesh, part robot, of clones, all are manifestations of phallotechnic boundary violation. The pseudo-creative power of boundary violations is clearly an invasion of women's bodies, spirits, and of all our kind: earth, air, fire, water.
Lierre's a member of Deep Green Resistance, which is one of our first signatory organisations for the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. It's an environmental organisation that's trying to do things to solve some of the problems that Lierre's laid out. So if you are one of the people who does want to be involved in the environmental movement, or with others who are really working on this, it's the only green organisation that has signed the declaration, apart from Georgia Green Party, who have also signed the declaration, but it's probably a less of a global organisation. So if you live in Georgia, join the Georgia Green Party. But if you're international, the Deep Green Resistance are a really good organisation, and they signed the declaration. And as I said, Lierre has been a feminist, she said a feminist sort of for many, many years. So it's a very, it's not as exhausting and tiring and problematic as joining pretty much any other green organisation who really don't understand our feminist politics.
Yeah, I was looking over some of the questions that women were typing in as we were talking. And one thing I do like to add, I try to put this in the body of every talk, but I had, narrowed it down to not go over. There's, often a lot of concern about the concept of sort of population control. And I mean, people are worried about this for good reason, because that's just created horrendous human rights horrors around the world, like China and the one-child policy. And of course, it's women who always bear the brunt of these things. But that's not a way forward. It doesn't even really work, besides being absolutely hellacious for women. The thing that does work, this really has been studied, and it's not something we need to be afraid of, because the thing that does work is raising the status of women and girls. If you want to drop the birth rate anywhere in the world, that's what you do. In fact, the number one thing you can do, there's one action that covers it all, and it's teach a girl to read. That when women and girls have even that much more power over their lives, they will be able to choose to have fewer children, and they do. As it turns out, all things being equal, like if everybody has enough food, housing, kind of basic stuff covers, the average couple really only wants 2 children. That's where it stabilizes. So we seem to have an internal mechanism that says replacement levels keep us happy, and that's kind of what most people want in the end. It's all these other pressures that drive population upward, with patriarchy and capitalism and all this kind of stuff. So really, we all have to be feminists. This was never a problem of people versus the planet. It was always people plus planet. And in this case, it really is planet plus girls is the solution forward. So we don't really need to be afraid of this. I know that terrible things have happened in the name of this, but we are not after population control. What we're after is empowering women and girls, and that really does solve a lot of it. And half the children born every single year, half of them are either unplanned or unwanted. And if you give women access to adequate health care, that would pretty much solve it. Though I would go one step further. We don't just need birth control, we need liberty. Like, women need to actually control who has access to our bodies and when and why. And right now, we don't around the world. We are men's property. So all of that has to be addressed to fix the problem, but it needs to be addressed anyway, because women and girls count.
So I'm really pleased now to move on to Susan Hawthorne. Susan Hawthorne is from Australia. She's a poet, a writer, and a political commentator. She's co-founder and director of independent feminist publisher Spinifex Press, who's another signatory organisation of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. Susan's going to talk to us about her new book, Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy. So thank you so much, Susan. Over to you.
Thank you very much. I feel really honoured to be here and be part of this. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from Jiru land in far north Queensland. I acknowledge that their relationship with the land has extended over many thousands of years, and as Elder Lilla Watson said back in 1984, for Aboriginal peoples, the future extends as far forward as the past. That's a very long and far-sighted plan, way more than a 5-year plan. If we can last the next 65,000 years, I think the Earth will be safe. The initial prompt for writing Vortex, and I didn't make slides, but that's a picture of my book, were requests from 2 publishers to write a short version of my earlier book, Wild Politics, Feminism, Globalization and Biodiversity. And that's that one, which was published back in 2002. But as I wrote, the book changed shape. In Vortex, I highlight the ways in which patriarchy destroys lives and destroys the planet. The word vortex has a twofold meaning. In an environmental context, it is the empty centre of a mass of air or water into which objects are drawn. So think of a cyclone or a tornado. In a literary sense, it is a dangerous or bad situation which you can't escape. Sounds familiar? These 2 meanings encapsulate where we stand in catastrophic neoliberal patriarchy. A key concept I follow throughout the book is the Trojan horse. The Trojan horse in ancient Greece is a story about trickery by Odysseus and the patriarchal Greeks, pretending to make an offering, a good thing, to the matrilineal Trojans. The Greeks had been fighting the Trojans for 10 long years. They had their ships on the beach below the walled city of Troy. The idea for the Trojan horse was cooked up by Odysseus, and the Greeks built a huge wooden horse and set it up outside the gates of Troy. They then sailed away in their ships. The Trojans, thinking it was a goodwill gesture from the departing Greeks, wheeled the horse through the impassable gates into the city. But that wooden horse was filled with Greek soldiers who burnt and routed the city of Troy once darkness fell. It's also the story of Cassandra, who is the daughter of the king and the queen. She predicted this and told her father, King Priam, not to bring the horse inside the walls, as it would end in disaster, but she was not believed. When she was a child, a snake had licked her ears, which enabled her to prophesy. It was a gift from the patriarchal god Apollo. But after spurning Apollo's sexual advances and threats of rape during the Trojan War, he put a curse on her so that even though she prophesied accurately, no one would ever believe her. The Trojan horse is the trickery used by the neoliberals, whether it's saying sex work is a job, the promise of technological fixes for people with a disability or for transgenders, development touted as progress for the landless, the colonised and those in poverty, the false solutions offered by climate deniers whose solutions exacerbate the problems. Cassandra's voice is that of all the women who have been disbelieved when they report a rape. All the lesbians whose suffering, including torture, corrective rape and murder, has been erased. Cassandra is the woman, including me as author, saying over and over again, listen, This is important. In both Vortex and Wild Politics, I address the issue of the destruction of ecological systems, and I try to come up with ways that they might be stopped. Feminism was central to my analysis, and my theoretical base in Wild Politics is feminist economics, ecofeminist theory, radical feminist theories of power, and the different ways in which women's work is not accounted. I did not have whole chapters on sexual violence, prostitution, and the torture of lesbians, as I do in Vortex. Women and the earth in patriarchal ideology are seen as passive for the use of men and male systems. Too bad if we are injured or if we die. We are also seen as endlessly fruitful and best kept subdued, pregnant, or in the case of the earth, endlessly producing crops, milk, meat, timber, and fossil fuels. This don't care attitude is resulting in huge numbers of women killed by partners or family members. 50,000 globally in 2018, according to a UN report for that year. And mass death of corals, devastating bushfires, flooding of rivers. Just in the last week, there was a glacier melt in India, which caused flooding, and ever-intensifying storms, cyclones, and other climate-related catastrophes. One way of thinking about solutions, there is no one-size-fits-all solution, is to shift from a culture in which money is the inspiration to one in which biodiversity is the inspiration. Instead of profit, a thriving, biodiverse, eco-social system is what we need. Biodiversity is a complex, self-sustaining system of an ecological niche in a particular locale. The details cannot be universalized, but the behaviors that sustain it can be. If biodiversity is your inspiration, then you can't drop bombs, you can't engage in industrial farming, fishing and forestry, you can't support surrogacy, prostitution, reproductive technologies, and other fake advances are not possible. Nor is a trans ideology of what Jennifer Bilek calls the transhumanist death cult. And that's not possible either. The principle of biodiversity is very like the principle of the personal is political. Use the local, the personal to inform your actions, but don't make the mistake of homogenizing, which is a behavior of disconnection. The trans ideologues have perverted the word diversity in their propaganda, since what they want is old-fashioned masculine and feminine sex stereotypes. In the neoliberal world, every technological failure is a new business opportunity. In the end, it will result in spiraling failure. The other aspect is constant vigilance about language distortion and erasure, being alert to appropriation and trickery, and constantly and loudly speaking out about these deranged philosophies. One of the surprises that emerged from my research for Vortex was the crossover of funders among climate deniers and environmental vandals, with funders of decriminalisation of prostitution and the transgenderism lobbyists. Among the climate profiteers are Monsanto Bayer, now one, just called Bayer because Monsanto has such a bad reputation, who on the 8th of January this year put out a statement about inclusivity and diversity. This is a quote from Bayer, Monsanto. Blend is the name of a global community at Bayer that was set up by the LGBTI employees and other supporters. Can you believe it? Their latest is to participate in Christopher Street protests wearing Bayer t-shirts. It's so extraordinary to me that they think a homogenized word like blend would be a great marketing idea. They should go and read The Lathe of Heaven by Ursula Le Guin and find out a bit more. But also it's extraordinary to me that the marchers find it acceptable to have representatives of an environmentally destructive company parading corporate T-shirts, while in so many pride marches, lesbians and radical feminists are vilified and booted out. So going on to the other funders, Warren Buffett and Bill Gates are on one another's foundation boards. They're both taken to task by Vandana Shiva and Kartika Shiva in their book Oneness versus the 1% for their environmentally destructive financial and business ventures, in which they pretend to be philanthropists. Remember the Trojan horse, it's no longer religious offerings, it's money offerings. Buffett's main commodity trade is cotton. In Australia, we've seen immensely destructive use of water from a river system, the Darling River system, now limping from one disaster to another. Warren Buffett is the father of Peter Buffett, who runs the pro-transgender Novo Foundation, handing out money to organisations who used to be run by and for LGBT people, and now simply spruik and fund the spread of the transgender ideology. Again, the Trojan horse, and astroturfing. If you don't know what astroturfing is, think about how grass becomes fake grass, your plastic grass. Well, astroturfing is grassroots become billionaire fake grassroots. So the LGBTIQA plus acronym is a key to all of this. The other name that comes up over and over in the funding of decriminalisation of sex work and the transgender ideology and law change is George Soros. The Soros Foundation's OSF has connections to Pfizer and Monsanto, that's now Bayer, and they do a lot of effective lobbying of governments. John Stryker and trans lesbian Colonel Jennifer James Pritzker and his relatives are among the others. They are massive funders of LGBTQA plus organisations. Penny Pritzker, a cousin of Colonel James Jennifer, worked in the Obama administration, and their foundation donated $25 million to Obama's childhood initiatives. So if you're wondering where the Biden changes to the Equality Act have come from, look no further. The state of the environment affects all of us in small ways and large. In Australia, this was made eerily apparent when the bushfires roared through from October 2019 to March 2020, during which time 18.6 million hectares were burnt. That's a massive amount of land. 34 people died, and around about 1 billion native animals also died. Grief at the state of the country was widespread. So was the sense that the Prime Minister was not only negligent, but also an abettor of the disaster through his government's policies. Indigenous peoples have been crying out for better fire management systems for years, what is called a cool burn. Women, especially feminists, have been at the forefront of the environmental movement. Think Rachel Carson and her book, Silent Spring. In Australia, think of Judith Wright, who was the key activist against the installation of oil wells in the Great Barrier Reef in the 1970s and protecting this extraordinary, huge biodiverse region. See her book, The Coral Battleground. Think Maria Mies and Vandana Shiva, their individual and combined work on linking women and the environment. See Maria's The Village and the World, but also Vandana's Staying Alive, Seeding Sovereignty, and many others. Think Farida Akhtar, whose work in Bangladesh focuses precisely on access to good health services for women, creating dowry-free and pesticide-free farming communities. See her books, Depopulating Bangladesh, Women and Trees, and Seeds of Movements. Think Suzanne Simard's work on the ways in which plants communicate, how trees use fungi and huge underground root networks to sustain one another. And I could go on for hours. There are many, many more women who could be named. The environmental movement would not exist without the ideas and actions of women, but so often the women are left out of the histories. In recent times, Green parties in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, probably elsewhere, have more than forgotten this history. They are in the process of erasing it altogether so that even speaking of it becomes taboo. And while there are many good women who've been involved over the years, the women inside the Greens now have to ensure that they do not speak like a radical feminist. I'm not a party joiner because I never felt that they would speak for me. The Australian Greens, I've been reading their policies, and they support sex as work, and they support inclusivity. They are not at the top of their list, and you have to read quite far down to see it. Most Greens these days have become neoliberal Greens, just as the feminists who get media attention are neoliberal feminists in the main. A number of high-profile people have resigned from the Greens. Beatrix Campbell, with whom I've not always agreed, resigned from the UK Green Party in July 2020. And she said that if the meaning of woman is emptied out, how can we address the fact that women everywhere in the world are put upon, discriminated against, oppressed, underpaid, unpaid, raped and disrespected because they're women? Andy Reitman, Scottish MP, also resigned recently. In both these instances and in New Zealand and Australia, the battle is over trans. The 2016 non-men of the UK Greens are found extraordinary. And then there's the slippage from women to trans women, which makes it impossible for any of us to fight for the rights of women when any day, at any time, any man can become a woman, with his rights much more protected than those of us born women. No one wants an oppression Olympics, but one simple test lies in the statistics on the murders of women and trans women. In 2018 in the UK, Karen Ingela-Smith put out a report on the murders of trans women. In a decade, there were 7. Let me repeat that, 7 in 10 years, as against around 1,000 women murdered in the same decade. Furthermore, there were more homicides perpetrated by biologically male trans people against biologically male trans people. That is, trans women against trans women. And trans people are perpetrators of homicide at 71% greater rates than they are victims. Do look up her site at www.kareningela-smith.com. To return to where I started talking about the environmental groups and asking whether there can be alliances between them and radical feminists, gender critical feminists, lesbian feminists, my answer is no, if they support inclusivity as one of their policies, and that seems to be the norm for Greens wherever they are. You have to look hard to find environmental groups worth joining. My advice is to start your own autonomous groups, as we did, especially in the 1970s and 80s. Only then can you be sure that your voice is heard and that your message is clear. One of the areas of my book that's very different from other books that critique patriarchy, capitalism, environmental disasters, and the neoliberal global system is a chapter I have called Colonisation, Erasure and Torture, Wars Against Lesbians. There are a few books that deal with lesbians on a global level. And as poet Gillian Hanscom writes, only other dykes are proud of dykes. And I would add, only other dykes care about dykes. I write about the ways in this chapter in which violence against lesbians is ignored or minimised, from Amnesty International reports, not a big surprise there, through to history books about the Nazi regime, even books about Ravensbrück, or books about rape in South Africa, in which corrective rape of lesbians is left out. But when lesbians write, you get to set the record straight. Sorry, no pun intended. I recommend to you an essay by Consuelo Rivera Fuentes and Linda Burke. It's called Talking with/in Pain, Reflections of Bodies Under Torture, and was published in 2001 in Women's Studies International Forum. In this essay, Consuelo writes about her experiences under the Pinochet regime in Chile in the 1970s. Linda draws Consuelo out in a difficult discussion. The question Consuelo asks is, where is my I? Where is my lesbian I? Consuelo writes, I am terrified that my body will betray me. Within heterosexual discourse, the lesbian epitomizes the body untrammeled. The lesbian body is perceived as a body out of control. It's ungoverned by heteropatriarchal rules. For the torturer, the prisoner's body has also become a body out of control, and this lack of control is shown each time pain is inflicted. The ability to dissociate so that lesbians don't count is the same dissociation that occurs when the planet doesn't count. The prisoner of torture is considered out of control. The lesbian is out of control. The tortured lesbian is therefore doubly out of control, and in a society where lesbians are defined as mentally ill, triply out of control. Since she's so clearly out of control, anything that happens to her is her fault, because if she chose to behave differently, she would not be tortured. Sorry, I just lost my spot. The torturer, the male sexual fantasist pornographer, is therefore able to abandon all sense of responsibility for his actions and for his beliefs about lesbians. It's in her interest that he torture her, rape her, show just how good he is. Or, as Elaine Scarry writes in her amazing book, The Body in Pain, every weapon has two ends. In converting the other person's pain into his own power, the torturer experiences the entire occurrence exclusively from the non-vulnerable end of the weapon. Throughout the period of writing Vortex, I also wanted to keep asking, where is my lesbian I? Where is the centrality of my lesbian being? Where is my experience as a lesbian recorded and recognised? The conversation between Consuelo and Linda is not an easy read, but it is essential reading. In addition to writing about Consuelo, I also cover the horrors of corrective rape, of levels of violence against Roma lesbians, the targeting of activists like Adoronte Apata from Nigeria and Fanny Ann Eddy from Sierra Leone, because they are lesbians. They were targeted. In Iran, so much shame is attached to being a lesbian that even refugee activists don't think lesbians are important enough to protest against their murder and torture. It is difficult to know very much about instances such as torture or murder or the numbers of lesbian refugees when no one is looking. Victoria Brownworth has been recording women's stories in the USA, the women who are being murdered, lesbians murdered. And Giti Tadani wrote about that in her book, in Sakiyani, which was published in 1996, a book about India. And with so many lesbian men around these days, the statistics become ever more distorted. But see my point above about the very low numbers of murders of trans women and the very high numbers of murders of women. So one of the questions I was asked was, what were my future projects? Well, Renata Klein and I have a wonderful project we're working on at the moment, which is an anthology. I need something happy, you know, after this, called Not Dead Yet. And it has around about 60 contributors of 70 years of age or older. And it's a wonderful history of the women's liberation movement and history of the 20th to 21st century. It'll be out in July 2021. For my own individual work, spending some three years on Vortex, I don't really feel like writing much at present. Of course, I am still to some extent, and I'm speaking in a number of places about my work. I haven't had a good idea for a poem for a while. I have the germ of an idea for a novel, but maybe it'll turn into a long poem instead. But in time, these things will come. With big projects, I never know where it will take me until I start. But I'll keep on keeping on, persisting and trying to stay ahead of the game. I was also asked to let you know where you can buy Vortex. For starters, go to the Spinifex Press website, which is www.spinifexpress.com.au. And there you'll find all the information that you need. If you go to the section called Order, you'll find where to get it in the UK and Europe, and that's from Gazelle Book Services, which is gazellebookservices.co.uk, and they're based in Lancaster. And in the US, Canada and Mexico, you can get books from www.ipgbook.com, and they're in Chicago. So if you order from the Spinifex page, you can, but you'll pay postage. So if the UK and the US are nearer to you, then check out those places. Thank you very much. I've been very pleased to speak tonight.
Thank you so much, Susan. That's completely brilliant and really interesting, very comprehensive sort of overview of a lot of what's been written by feminists and environmentalists, and a sort of modernization, sort of bringing it all up to date with what's happening now. So Spinifex Books, I think many of you know them. They have a fantastic catalogue, back catalogue of books. So that's also worth looking at.
Lierre, it's really good that you raised that issue of why population control is a bad thing. Really, what's far more important is the control of consumption. About 2 decades ago, when I read these statistics, people in the US were consuming 39 times the amount that anybody in, say, Bangladesh or India were consuming. So let's start by reducing our consumption by 39 times, getting it down. And in fact, it was one of the good things that came out of the pandemic, was that there weren't as many cars, there weren't as many planes, there a big reduction in lots of activity, which actually was very good for the planet. However, the minute that people are allowed out again, consumption really skyrocketed. The other thing I thought that was interesting in what you were talking about, Lierre, was the history of agriculture and so forth. And I absolutely agree with you that agriculture did bring with it war and so forth. But there are many people, many groups of people around the world who have engaged in agriculture who didn't do that. I mean, in Australia, for example, Indigenous people have actually been doing agriculture for at least 30,000 years, possibly many tens of thousands of years more, but they didn't use it as a way to conquer somebody else. They used it in a mix, in with a mix of other things that they did. So I think that the other thing is the connection to the images you showed of women, from 30 odd thousand years ago and so forth. I think that's a really interesting point to make. And I have a small section in Vortex about prehistory and how that's connected to what I'm writing about, and the need for us to decolonize, deindustrialize, degrow, all of those things need to happen. I don't know how it's going to happen, but oh boy, it's certainly an urgent thing to have happen.
Right, so now we're moving to Kate Graham. Kate Graham is from the UK. She's been involved to a greater or lesser extent with lesbian feminism since coming out in 1975. So she's going to give us talk about feminism, environmentalism, and what she's been thinking about in terms of politics. Thank you so much, Kate. Over to you.
Thanks very much. Thank you. It's a real honour and a privilege to be on this along with Lierre and Susan. And I don't know if I can measure up to their presentations, but I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about radical feminism, lesbian feminism, and to share some of the ideas and thoughts that I've had over many years now. I wanted to, let me just open that door. I wanted to talk about the context, the environment, if you like, of our working together and our consciousness and our action, our women's rights activities such as they are. I mean, I came into radical feminism through lesbian feminism. We had a little, radical lesbian feminist group in Edinburgh. And, you know, back in 1975, you know, we really sort of asked ourselves, what did we mean by our lesbianism, you know? So the thing is, you know, we asked ourselves, what did we mean by lesbianism? And we questioned everything. We questioned everything. And I really don't see that now in today's, you know, queer groups at all. That, you know, we explored the boundaries of friendships. We questioned what it is to have a sexual relationship. We questioned obviously monogamy and you know, things like that, and marriage and whatnot. And you know, it was that was what informed our understanding of radical feminism as well. You know, it's like, what is possible? You know, what can we do with this world, and what are the possibilities of remaking the world? Yeah. Now it seems to me that we all have to do that really quite urgently. If we're to address the really frightening and alarming situation that we find ourselves in, that Lierre and Susan have drawn our attention to, yeah, and that's what I don't see happening. Look, it seems to me that we all come to our feminism through different routes. Lots of us come, like myself, through lesbianism. Many women come through experience of rape or sexual violence. Many women have come, particularly to this, you know, platform, through our shock and horror regarding the trans agenda, and you know, some other women come through issues at work. Women come through, you know, divorce. Women come through difficulties getting custody of kids. Women come through not having access to education or career opportunities, all sorts of different things. Women come through trying to escape controlling men, whether they're fathers or brothers or husbands. We all arrive at some sort of one of the facets, one of the faces of feminism. Look, it seems to me that as radical feminists, our job is to be the hub that connects all these different aspects of male supremacy as we experience them. And in order to do that, we've got to be able to work together much better than we're able to at the moment, you know. So I want to ask those of us that are watching this, who are radical feminists, to begin again to ask ourselves about how we propose to have a feminist revolution. When I was, I think, 18, we had a conference in Edinburgh called the Radical Feminist Theory of Revolution. And to my mind, it was the first time that radical feminists and revolutionary feminists at that time had got together to try and envisage how we could bring about feminist revolution. And, you know, I don't think that we've actually made much progress. So, you know, I think we really need to, because let's face it, men are not going to change this. Men are not going to change this situation, and patriarchal structures and patriarchal ways of working are, I think, inadequate, never mind insufficient. So we really have to begin to understand how we can work together on this. It seems to me it's quite evident that male organizations and structures are hierarchical. Men are comfortable when they know where they are in a hierarchy, and that's how their setups work. And we as women, our working relationships and social relationships are very, very different. I mean, we used to discuss this stuff. We had the lesbian feminist journal called Ethics that was briefly published back in the second wave, and we had one called Gossip as well. I think that was we questioned how we communicate and what respect and what sense we make of what we say to each other, and I think we need to do that. Now, obviously, it comes, our understanding's got to come from consciousness raising. It's got to come from examining our own lives. The personal is political, yeah. It means that what is happening in our lives and our experience is informed by our experience of power and control. Now, Dee Graham wrote a book called Loving to Survive, which I think is under-read and under-acknowledged amongst us. And it's basically, her thesis is, as I understand it, that Stockholm syndrome can be extrapolated to, enlarged to include a whole class, and that is what we've done as women. We've all experienced male control and male threats and male power and abuse by men, and we have inculcated, we've accepted, we've now, understood that men as a class have that power. And this affects our understanding of, everything, basically. I think we have to be brave, and it's absolutely crucial, if you haven't done so, that you must read Mary Daly's Gynecology. I don't read a lot, but that is absolutely fundamental. We must read it because that is one of the books that exposes the universality not only of patriarchy and male power, but of men's hatred of women. It's not just that men control us, it's their hatred of us and their spiritual, if you can call it that, their death worship, their I can't possibly put it better than Mary Daly. I'm so glad that Lierre managed to find that quote there. It's just excellent there. Thank you. We've got to start with that, right? We've got to start with the realization of the universality of male supremacy across the world throughout time, right? Throughout patriarchy. And we've got to start thinking to ourselves, how are we going to deal with men? How are we going to deal with them in the future, assuming that there is a future for us to have? There are ways of thinking that, Susan and Lierre have talked about that quite well. Thank you. Their ways of thinking are seriously fucked. Come here. Excuse me. Come here. Come here. Excuse me. Sorry. Come here. Good girl. Come here. Good girl. Yeah, their ways of thinking are seriously fucked. I mean, Plato, who, more or less invented logic, and logic is based on him saying a thing either is or it is not. This whole idea of a boundary between something and another thing. And every woman who's experienced pregnancy can see the flaws in that. I mean, it's just, this is male thinking, and male thinking is not going to solve our problem. I mean, there are things that I respect very much. I respect science. I think that rational thinking is really important and incredibly helpful, and analysis is, has to be based on some sort of understanding of logic and reasonable thinking. But it's not enough to take us through what we face now. We have to step up. We have to take part fully, and probably take over, actually, in order to deal with the climate emergency and the catastrophe that we're seeing at the end of the American empire and the fall of capitalism here. Yeah, thanks. I'm getting distracted by the chat. So there are some wonderful writers here, apart from Mary Daly. Of course, I want to draw your attention to Summer Brodribb, who Spinifex published, must be 30 years ago, 25 years ago now, who did a book critiquing postmodernism called Nothing Matters. And it's a really deep, difficult, demanding book. And she was an absolute genius to do it. And I'm so glad that she did. But she's kind of disappeared. And this has happened to a lot of women from the second wave and since then, right? It's not only about how we can work together, it's how we can sustain each other. I've lots of friends from the second wave who are not around now. They're all off making money, hopefully doing well, dealing with their lives and their individual solution, And I'm sure we can all think of lots of us can think of women who were very active and who fully understand some aspects of the situation that we live under with male supremacy, but who are not active now and who are not involved in any campaigning work or any sort of women's rights activism. You've got women who you would expect to be very acutely aware, a lot of women working in women's aid, for instance, who are hook, line and sinker with this trans bullshit, and what the hell's going on with that? Why? I can see someone talking about economics there. Let's do that. So I'm distracted with the chat. Sorry. So let's look at economics, right? I was mentioned briefly there. We've got an economics based on market price, right? We need to transform that. That needs to be completely shifted to an economics based on value somehow. And there are maybe 5 or 6 things I can think of off the top of my head that account for value. There's a resource value. There's the energy content value, the input of energy. There's the replacement or irreplaceability value. There's the environmental cost in terms of what is to every aspect of everything that we buy and use and trade. I mean, this should be a massive thing. Feminism should be massively engaged in reinventing economics right now. And why isn't it? Where are the feminist economic? As far as I'm aware, they're little moved on from wages for housework. It's pathetic. It's just not good enough, So my sort of plea is that we all can learn how to involve each other, communicate with each other, and educate ourselves in these different realms, in arenas, in order to try to come to make sense of it instead of this. I mean, how the hell we're supposed to do that? I don't know. I know everybody's exhausted. I know everybody's just spending our times playing whack-a-mole, dealing with the bloody violence, that we're faced with every day. Okay, so the problem with that is that when we're doing that, when we're responding to the situations that we find ourselves in, we're getting criticism from other feminists, aren't we? I mean, to take one of the recent things, we've got a lot of prominent feminists criticizing Wolf in America and some anti-trans activists here for doing lobbying work and legal work with men who are lawyers, who have previously worked with right-wing organizations or Christian organizations, and with women who are not feminists. I mean, look, a huge part of women's rights activism is involved in changing the law, right? That's why it's called women's rights activism, you know? So these people think that changing the law is a good route to take in order to try to protect women and advance our opportunities in education and work and housing and legally and all the rest of it. So of course they're going to lobby with other people who share their single issue campaign goals. You know, it's not acceptable that feminists deride and berate each other when we're all trying to do what we see as the best thing in order to promote women's our agenda. You know, it's fine to have the debate and the discussion. I'm absolutely for that. But these kind of soundbite, throwaway, bitter, sardonic criticisms, these Twitter, you know, assaults lobbed like bloody grenades or something, you know, it's not doing anybody any good whatsoever. We desperately, urgently must come together. We've got masses of work to do. I mean, you know, look at geography. Look at geography. You've got political and social geography. Anybody who's ever tried to live with a bunch of other women knows that, I mean, you can't find housing to do that. Housing is not set up for that. Housing is set up for the nuclear family, right? And, you know, large scale kind of more, I think of them as organic collections of, you know, social housing. They're just not being built. And the cities and the towns and the various places that we try to live are completely inappropriate for us. They're completely inappropriate. And I mean, anybody who's ever tried to live in a flat with a bunch of people know that even if you started off being best of friends, you'd be arguing and you'd be having conflict before too long because of the pressures of that. So, you know, for us to find a way forward, right? How are we going, what environment are we going to make culturally, socially, spiritually, physically with each other so that we can actually work toward a solution to the mess, the crisis that we find ourselves in? That's what we need to do.
Why do you think that the green movement, environmentalists, have not made the link between patriarchy and the environment? You know, in your experience, have you tried to argue with them and explain that we can't have a planet and patriarchy, or you know, and have you got anywhere? Is there anything that helps when you try to discuss it with them? So maybe if we ask Lierre first and go around again.
Well, my answer to that was to start my own organization because it was just unbearable. So, you know, after we wrote the book, Deep Green Resistance, we then started a group called that. And we now have like 500 members around the world, which is pretty cool. But we have really basic radical feminist principles that you have to agree to first before you can join. So we have kind of a slice of sort of the cream of the crop. You know, this is people, both men and women, who get the link already. So I don't have to have those fights anymore. But otherwise, I don't know. I mean, you're up against what you're up against always with men. They don't want to hear it. They don't want to know about it. They don't want to question, you know, their prerogatives and their, you know, their entitlements. And it's just an endless battle with them.
But that's interesting that you can, if you have a constitution or some rules that they need to sign up to, that any member needs to sign up to, which is based on radical feminism, then you're saying that it's possible to work with men in deep green resistance on this other issue, and they're not undermining it because of their patriarchal views. So it's a sort of basis from which you can do environmental work.
I mean, we're like a little magnet. We attract the men who already understand this, whether they have the language for it or not. They already get that it's destroying their souls and destroying the planet to be dominators. And so they're really, really happy to come out of other groups and join us because we don't do that. And the men really do hold each other to account. They don't let them, you know, behave like this. So it's a really nice little community, honestly. I never really, if you had told me 20 years ago I'd be friends with men, I wouldn't have believed it. But some of them have really become my friends and my comrades. And it's nice. It's nice to know that it's possible. I'm not saying anybody else has to do it, but it can be done.
Yeah, I mean, it's good, and it's a sort of way forward. It's possibly a solution for working a way to that you can work with men, that they've got it working reasonably well or very well in deep green resistance. So let's go to Susan. How about you? Did you ever try to work with men on environmental stuff, or women who are very pro patriarchy?
No, I gave up on that before I could start. And I think I did vote for the Greens for many years because I wanted their policies. I thought their policies on the environment were much better than Labor, which is caught in a terrible spiral, a negative spiral, I think, about jobs, which means more mines, more factory, more industrialization, all of that stuff. So Labor is captured there. But the Greens, it's probably been about the last 10 years or so that the Greens were first captured by the prostitution, the sex work lobby, because in Victoria, in Australia, prostitution has been legal since 1984. So that became seen as a progressive thing to do, to support the women who were involved in the sex industry without actually questioning anything, without looking at what the real conditions for women are. And then more recently, they've really taken on the whole postmodern queer transgender ideology. And I know there are people within the Greens I know who are really annoyed about this, but they don't have any say. And they just have arguments all the time. But one group that was set up back in the 80s was FinRage. FinRage was the Feminist International Network of Resistance to Reproductive and Genetic Engineering. And Farida Akhtar was a member of that, Maria Mies, Renata Klein, and many, many others. And in that group, they brought together issues around women's bodies, but they also talked about the environment. So for Farida's work in communities in Bangladesh about dowry-free and pesticide-free, they always saw the connection between how women were treated and how the earth was treated. And I don't think, I mean, it's possible for men to see that, but I think, like Lierre, it's best to set up your own groups and maybe coalesce, if there are groups nearby one another, bring them together. But I think that's the only way to do it. And FinRage became a really strong international group. They produced lots and lots of books and lots of conferences and all sorts of things. So it's possible to do that if you just get out and do it.
Thanks so much, Susan. So let's go back to Kate for just a couple more words, if possible.
Yeah, thanks. I think that I'm not involved in an environmental group other than the DGR. I kind of hang on to the coattails of that. But on the river, I've been, since I've been bolting, I've been chucked out of every group because of being an evil TERF. So, the men just throw me out. There's, and the women, actually, some of the women as well. I'm just a bigot, according to them. So it's impossible to get anywhere to even begin. But look, I wanted to say something about a woman called Evelyn Fox Keller, who's a science writer. And she's written some really interesting stuff about biology and genetics, you might not have been aware of. She wrote a biography as well of this amazing woman called A Feeling for the Organism, about a woman who was genius, groundbreaking woman whose name escapes me right now. So the thing is about Evelyn Fox Keller is that she has tried to convey to the layperson the kind of thinking that we need to create and become familiar with in order to understand the complexities of the interrelationships between genetics, biology, and the environment. And look, it's dialectical, but it's even sort of more nuanced and difficult than that. It's not simple and it's not causative. It's not, this produces this and therefore, it's not linear, right? And I think a lot of us are sadly I certainly am lacking in our skills in being able to engage with complex debates like the one we need to have about human society and the environment, because our thinking skills are so antiquated and inadequate.